You said something 3 days ago and you're still replaying it. Not because anything went wrong, just in case it did. You've rehearsed a conversation 17 times for a meeting that hasn't happened. You built a full courtroom case for a conflict that exists only in your head. Evidence, counterarguments, verdict. The verdict always finds you guilty. At 3 in the morning, your mind is running scenarios for a relationship that feels fine. You can't explain why. It just doesn't feel safe to stop. This isn't a thinking problem. This is a nervous system that learned, a very long time ago, that thinking was the only form of control available to it. And it never got the memo that the emergency ended. If I think about it enough, I can control how it turns out. That sentence has lived in your body for so long, it doesn't even feel like a thought anymore. It feels like fact. Overthinking at its core is not a cognitive habit. It is a control strategy. And it was built in an environment where things were genuinely unpredictable, where the emotional temperature of a room could shift without warning, where a parent's mood was a weather system you had no forecast for, where the wrong word at the wrong moment could detonate something you'd spend days trying to repair. In that environment, thinking harder felt like the only lever you had. If you could just anticipate every variable, model every outcome, prepare a response for every possible reaction, then maybe, you could prevent the thing you were always bracing for. Psychologist Albert Bandura's work on perceived self-efficacy describes exactly this mechanism. When people feel they have no direct control over their environment, they compensate through cognitive over-preparation. The child who couldn't control the adult's behavior learned to control the only thing available, their own mental simulation of it. In adulthood, this looks like running through every possible interpretation of a text message before responding, rehearsing conversations word for word, lying awake constructing arguments for conflicts that may never materialize. The thinking feels productive because it once was. It was the only tool that gave you any sense of agency in a space where agency was scarce. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when a child's mind learned that thinking was the only form of safety it could manufacture for itself. I need to know exactly how they feel about me. I need to be sure. The uncertainty is the thing you cannot tolerate. Not the conflict, not even the outcome, but the not knowing. And that intolerance didn't form in adulthood. It formed in a home where love was inconsistent, where warmth appeared and disappeared without a discernible pattern, where you could do everything right and still end a day feeling like you'd failed some test you hadn't been told you were taking. Inconsistent caregiving, what attachment researchers call an anxious attachment pattern, mapped by John Bowlby and developed by Mary Ainsworth, produces a specific kind of hyperactivation in the child's attachment system. The nervous system, unable to predict when comfort will be available, stays permanently switched on, scanning, monitoring, searching for data. Not because the child is neurotic, but because the environment was genuinely unreliable, and sustained vigilance was the rational adaptive response. In adulthood, this translates directly into the overthinking loop. You analyze tone of voice for signs of withdrawal. You reread messages looking for subtext. You replay social interactions in exhaustive detail, cataloging every moment where you might have said something wrong, been too much, asked for too much. The mind is not catastrophizing for sport. It is doing what it was trained to do, monitoring attachment signals for early warning of abandonment. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when the first relationship you ever had taught you that love required constant surveillance to maintain. Something feels wrong, but I can't figure out what. So I keep thinking. There is a specific kind of overthinking that isn't about solving a problem. It's about locating one. A formless sense of dread that has no address. An unease that floats freely and attaches itself to whatever is nearest. A conversation from yesterday. A decision from last week. A relationship that might be shifting in ways you can't yet prove. This isn't anxiety about a thing. This is free-floating anxiety looking for a thing to justify itself. And it was trained into you in a household where emotions were either punished, ignored, or simply never named. Psychologist Peter Fonagy's research on mentalization, the capacity to understand mental states in oneself and others, shows that this capacity develops almost entirely through early caregiving. When a parent consistently names, reflects, and validates a child's emotional experience, the child develops a rich internal vocabulary for what they feel and why. When that attunement is absent, the child grows up with emotions that arrive without labels. The feeling is there, large, urgent, unmistakable, but there is no filing system for it, no category, no cause. And so the mind does the only thing it can. It searches. It generates hypotheses. It overthinks, not to solve the problem, but to find it. Because a named problem feels infinitely more manageable than a nameless dread. In adulthood, this is the 3 a.m. mind that cannot locate the source of its own panic. The spiral that begins with one small worry and ends somewhere completely unrelated. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when no one ever taught you the language for your own interior, so you spend your adult life translating a feeling you can't quite name. Now, stop for a second. 3 mechanisms, and they all point to the same thing. Your overthinking was never a flaw. It was a solution, a real, functional, intelligent solution to a set of real problems. An unpredictable environment, an unreliable attachment figure, an internal world that was never given the tools to process itself. The problem is not that the solution was wrong. The problem is that it worked. And now it runs automatically, in conditions that no longer require it, against threats that no longer exist, in a nervous system that never got the update. I just need to figure out the right answer, and then I'll feel better. You have noticed, probably, that this never actually happens. You reach a conclusion, and instead of relief, there is a brief pause, and then the thinking starts again, a little further along the same track. This is the loop that psychologists call rumination, and it is one of the most researched phenomena in clinical psychology precisely because it feels so much like problem solving while producing none of problem solving's actual results. Yale psychologist Susan Nolen-Hoeksema drew a precise distinction between analytical thinking, which moves toward resolution, and ruminative thinking, which cycles through the same material repeatedly without generating new information or conclusions. The critical difference is not the content of the thoughts, but their function. Analytical thinking is oriented toward action. Ruminative thinking is oriented toward certainty. And certainty, for someone raised in an unpredictable environment, is not a destination. It is an endlessly retreating horizon. The childhood origin of this pattern is the home where resolution was never available, where conflicts didn't get repaired, they just eventually went quiet, where apologies didn't come, explanations didn't follow, and the child was left holding the emotional weight of an event that had no closure. The mind that never learned what resolution felt like doesn't know when to stop looking for it. So it keeps processing the same material, turning it over, re-examining it from new angles, not out of compulsion, but out of a genuine, learned belief that if it just thinks a little harder, clarity will finally arrive. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when you grew up in a house where nothing ever fully resolved, and your nervous system never learned what it felt like to let something be finished. What if I'm the problem? What if it's always been me? At the center of chronic overthinking, underneath the control strategies and the attachment monitoring and the unnameable dread, there's almost always this, a fundamental uncertainty about your own worth. Not the dramatic kind of self-doubt that announces itself loudly. The quiet, structural kind. The question that runs beneath every interaction, every decision, every relationship. Like a low-frequency hum you've stopped consciously hearing, but that shapes everything anyway. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness identifies a pattern he calls an internal, stable, global attribution style. The tendency to explain negative events as being caused by something fixed and fundamental about yourself. Not I made a mistake, but I am a mistake. Not this went wrong, but I caused things to go wrong. This explanatory style is not chosen. It is absorbed from an environment where the child was consistently the identified source of problems. Too loud, too sensitive, too much, never enough. Or where they were simply never given explicit evidence to the contrary. The brain that learned its own inadequacy as a foundational fact doesn't process ambiguous situations neutrally. Every unreturned message becomes evidence. Every awkward pause becomes confirmation. Every uncertainty collapses inward, toward the same preformed conclusion that was waiting there long before the situation began. And so the overthinking is not really about the thing it appears to be about. It is an ongoing, never quite resolved trial in which you are both the defendant and the prosecutor, relitigating the same foundational question your childhood left unanswered. Am I enough, actually, at the base level without conditions? This isn't weakness. This is what happens when the people who were supposed to answer that question early, clearly, and unconditionally didn't. The overthinking was never the problem. It was the answer, the best answer a child's mind could construct with the materials available. An environment that didn't feel safe taught a brain to stay alert. A love that felt conditional taught a nervous system to keep monitoring. A world that never resolved taught a mind to keep processing. None of that required a cruel parent or a dramatic event. It just required enough inconsistency, enough silence, enough unspoken uncertainty, repeated over enough years. The cost is real. The exhaustion of a mind that cannot rest. The relationships worn thin by constant analysis. The moments of actual life missed because you were somewhere in your head rehearsing them instead of living them. So the question isn't how to stop thinking. The question is, what would change? Not tomorrow, not after some long process. If you finally stopped treating every moment of uncertainty as evidence that the original verdict was right,